In this video, we're going to look at if-else-if statements. And an if-else-if statement combines an if-else with another if statement is basically what it does, because sometimes we need to check multiple things. And let's take a look at how that happens. So here's an example using a grade. A user gets a grade based on a 100-point grade scale. 90 is an A, 80 is a B. So let's look at the code on how we might do this. We could say if the person's score was greater than or equal to 90, the system could print out an A. If it wasn't greater than a 90, we have an else block, and we can do another test. If the score is greater than an 80, system print out a B. But if it wasn't that, otherwise, if that wasn't true, we do another test to see if it was greater than a 70 and print out a C. And you can see all these indents we have going on because we want to indent our code for each of our blocks. So this if statement gets indented under this else, this if statement gets under that else, this if statement goes under that else. And finally, at the very end, we have an else without an if. So if all these test negative, when we get false for all of them, the else statement's going to print out, hey, you got an F. Because obviously, if we got down this far, that wasn't above a 60 or a 70 or an 80 or 90, that means it was below 60 and the person failed. Okay. This is great, and technically it works, but when you start getting this many levels of indentation, it starts getting confusing. So the better way to do an if-else-if is like this. Put your else and if on the same line, and it works the same way. If the score was greater than 90, I'm going to print an A. Else if, and in some languages, those two words actually even get combined. Java isn't one. Java still keeps them separate. But else if the score is greater than 80, else if the score is greater than 70, there on down. This is a whole lot easier to read than this over here with all the indents. And it also takes up less lines because you don't have all these single else statements hanging out there. It's else if, ending with an else. Else is usually considered the default case. If all the tests fail, because there's multiple tests here, there's a test, there's a test, there's a test, there's a test. If all of them test false, this one will always run at the end. If any of these test true at any point, it will skip down and it will not do any of the other tests. Okay, so the first time we find a valid condition, the block underneath the next one will run and it will skip all the rest. We won't even be doing the tests anymore. It just skips everything else. So let's take a look at the flow chart for that. So we tested the person's score. If the score is greater than or equal to 90, we'll go ahead and print an A. It's going to skip all these other tests the minute it finds one that's true. If that was false, it's going to test this one. If that's false, it's going to test this one. But the minute it finds a true one, if it was greater than 70, but it wasn't greater than 80, we're going to print it's a C. We're not even going to test to see if it's greater than 60. We're going to skip the default case and move on. So let's take a look at this program running if the user had a score of 70. It's going to do this test. Score is greater than or equal to 90. That's false. So it is not going to do this statement. It's going to skip down and test this one. 70 is not greater than or equal to 80. Okay, so it's going to skip this statement and go down to the next test. Score greater than or equal to 70. This time that condition is true. It's going to print out C, and then it jumps down past the end of the if-else blocks and continues with whatever code might follow it. Okay, we exit out of the if statement as soon as we find a true one. Some notes. And this kind of goes back to what I said in a previous video about always use your curly braces even if you're doing single line statements because it causes a lot less confusion. Okay. One thing to note is that the else clause matches the most recent if clause in the same block. Okay, so if I do this, if I is greater than J, and then if I is greater than K, which else does this go with? Does it go with this if or that if? Okay, and it's hard to tell because we don't have any curly braces, but technically this else is going to go with that if statement. Okay, it's going to go with the second if statement. Okay, so this is a better way with correct indentation to read it, but I still don't think it's even the best way. When it starts getting in cases like this where it could get confused, it's better to start adding some curly braces. If I want to change what that else goes with, I have to use curly braces. I can say if I is greater than j, and I put a curly block that only tests this if I was greater than j, and it skips this if it doesn't. That way this if doesn't go with that if, it goes with the first one. So curly braces can change that. And back on the previous slide, if I would have curly braces on each one of these, it would be more clear from the beginning that this else goes with this if statement. Okay, so this is one of those cases where I say for new programmers, it's better to use the curly braces all the time. I don't even know if I should say this just for new programmers. I think it's just good programming practice for anybody, because you never know who's going to be coming in and editing your code. All right, in the next video, we're going to look at some common errors, some tips, and some cautions when doing these.